This is Transparency, a podcast by Gender Dysphoria Alliance, hosted by Aaron Kimberly and Aaron Terrell. Each week we'll be joined by people who have personal or professional experience with gender dysphoria and physical transition. We'll also discuss how our trans experiences relate to the concept of gender identity. Join us for a compassionate yet heterodox approach to the question of trans.
Our guest today, Marc, is a 40-year-old married transsexual man from Michigan. By day, he is a senior legal processor at a real estate law firm. He and his wife also have an Etsy business called the Winking Owl Designs. Marc describes himself as an old hippie soul, an avid animal lover, music lover, cannabis connoisseur, and lover of all humans. He started speaking publicly about some of the things going on in the LGBT community about a year ago because he doesn't agree with many of the things being pushed by the transgender ideology, especially once they brought children into the fight. He joined the board of Transsexual Unity to help others find understanding, build bridges, and find common ground through open conversation. And here's our conversation with Marc.
Welcome back to Transparency. We are grateful to be joined by Marc today. Marc is a fellow trans man who has come around to not being so stoked on where the movement has gone. Movement, if you want to call it that. Anyway, thanks so much for being here with us, Marc.
Absolutely.
I especially like your background.
Thanks.
So yeah, you are. If you want to just kind of let us know, like how we like to start is like your early life, your kind of feelings about gender, what the experience of gender dysphoria was, things like that.
Sure. So I actually grew up in a Christian conservative home. So
many of that has that in common.
Yeah. So I mean, like we were the type of family that was going to church like twice a week, and I was highly involved in like the teen portion of that, like the separate aspect of that. I did missions trips. I did a lot of that stuff. So early life, my parents have told me that they remember there were a few times where I kind of brought up like, hey, I think I was supposed to be a boy, like at a young age, and it not like a very common thing. It wasn't something I said really often. And of course, they just were like, "Well, you're a girl. You're gonna grow up to be a girl, like whatever." So I mean, I just took that at face value and what they told me. So I mean, I didn't really like most of my gender dysphoria when I was like young, and I'll say like pre-teenager, was mostly just into like the typical masculine things. And so I was just, I was closer to my brother and my dad. I typically like to do, things that boys like to do typically. And I was highly involved in sports from a young age. Like anytime, I was like playing with friends or doing something like that, I was always like the dad or the son or the father role or some type of, male role. Like anytime I was doing like play with kids and stuff like that as well. Anytime I was playing video games, it was always a male avatar. Like, I was kind of expressing it in like and that was I feel like that was my way of expressing myself through those interactions, like as a child. It wasn't really until puberty hit, obviously, that I really started to feel very uncomfortable in my body. And even at a young age, I had a very strong aversion to breasts, like in general, like even on like other people. And I would always talk to my mom and my family and say like, when I get those, I'm cutting them off. It was something I said since I was really young. And they were just kind of like, oh, it's gonna happen, it's just a female thing, and like hopefully it won't be too bad for you. And of course I ended up having like double D's, and I feel like I woke up like the next day, and that was like highly dysphoric for me. But at the time I didn't really know. I had nothing. I'm 40 now, so I grew up in the 80s and the 90s, so like I didn't really know many gay people, let alone trans people. Like trans wasn't a word, I didn't know about it. If anything I knew about was like the Maury Povich show. It's just like, is this a man or a woman? Like that's legitimately all I knew about it. And so what more happened with me in puberty was like I realized that I was same-sex attracted, that I was attracted to females. And that was very hard for me because I really started to realize that when I was about 13 or 14. And that was hard to me to kind of come to a place of accepting that because of my religious upbringing. So like I had a lot of inner turmoil within myself of being like, I shouldn't be like this. I've been taught my whole life that this is wrong, this is a sin, and that I shouldn't be like this. So that was very hard for me. And it took me like a couple years to really come to terms and grips with that and admit that, to my family. Um, and that did not go well. Like I admitted it to my family when I was 17, and it didn't go well. They weren't very pleased at all, and I actually we stopped talking for 2 years, and so and it was because of the religious aspect of it, and like at the time they were just like, we don't condone that action and what you're doing. But a
You
lot
said
of other stuff happened.
you were
Go
only
ahead.
17. Were you living on your own in that case?
So what happened was when I came out, my parents actually sent me to a mental hospital because in their eyes, it was a mental disorder, and they assumed that I just needed fixing, right? And so I
Wow.
spent 2 months in a mental institution, and so also um, I was adopted, but I was adopted within the family. So like my biological mother gave me to her sister. So like my aunt, my uncle raised me, and they adopted me when I was 5. And so I had a lot of early childhood trauma that I don't remember prior to the age of 5. Like I don't remember anything prior to being adopted, but I do know from my biological mother and my biological half sister that there was emotional and physical abuse within the home, possible sexual abuse as well. Um, so yeah, so that also happened, and so what happened when I went into the mental hospital, I kind of after that happened, I didn't want to go back home to my adoptive parents, so I had reached out to my biological half sister, and she was more accepting, and so was my biological mother. So I actually went to go live with my biological mother for the rest of that, until I was like 18. And I actually had a girlfriend at the time, and she was a year ahead of me in school. So when she moved to college, I couldn't handle it, and I basically dropped out and followed her up to college. So um, that's what happened, and that was most of like my early life was really just living as a lesbian. There were many times throughout the years where I thought something's still off, something still different about me, and I couldn't really pinpoint what that was. um, so throughout the course of my life, I've been to therapy for many, many, many years. But prior to my transition, which I didn't transition until the age of 34, and prior to my transition, that was in 2017. So prior to that, I was in therapy for about 6 years, working on personal issues like other stuff. I have I at the time I had depression, anxiety, PTSD. So I was working through a lot of those issues and things that I needed to work through. And through the course of all of that, I kind of there were a few times I had talked to my therapist about the fact where it never was like, I think I'm trans, because that still really wasn't like a huge word around it. I was just like, I think I was meant to be a guy, I've always felt that way. But it was something I kind of talked about in therapy, like once or twice a year, because it was something I really pushed away. I was really like, I just don't, and for a long time I felt like I had internalized homophobia from my upbringing, and I felt like that contributed to me like constantly pushing that feeling away for a very long time. So went through my therapy and like working through all of my other problems, um, this was the remaining problem that continued to finally I got to a place where I'd worked through mostly everything, and like this was still very highly prevalent, and I was like, I have to deal with this. So when I decided to actually confront that issue, that's when I finally I saw I was seeing my therapist, and then she had sent me to like a gender therapist specifically because she was like, she was LGBTQ friendly and everything, but she was like, I don't really deal with the whole gender stuff, and she's like, I don't want to lead you in a path. She was very like very great about it, my first therapist. And so she sent me to this other therapist, and then I talked to her. And I mean, she affirmed me. I mean, I'm not going to lie, even in 2017, she affirmed me by the third meeting, But she was like, you definitely have gender dysphoria. We went through the DSM-5 and, we talked about it. She was like, you definitely have gender dysphoria. And I was diagnosed with gender dysphoria. And then I decided that I thought my best course of action would be to medically transition after much thought. I mean, it wasn't like a quick decision for me. I really sat down and did my research before I transitioned. I tried to find as much research as I could in 2017, and it's so crazy to me because compared to just 2017, when I was like trying to look up info, it was hard to find. Like, especially female to male transition. It was really easy to find male to female transition stuff, but it was really hard to find stuff relating to me. I think I found like 2 podcasts and like one person, back then. And like obviously I knew of like Buck Angel and Jazz Bono because they were like high profile people, but it wasn't like, to me, like what's happening today with like it just being so prevalent, like those words weren't there for me. So it's like I never knew what trans was. I didn't know what that was until I was old enough to really understand that, and until those terms really started coming in and I did my own research. And I even watched like detransitioner videos back then, which there were barely any, but I tried to find everything I could because I wanted to see all sides and all aspects of everything before I made that decision, because I knew this is a life altering decision. Like this is going to physically alter my body and my life if I choose to do this. So I wanted to make sure that I was making the right decision. So after all that research and talking to my wife and talking about it, I decided that that would be the route I was going to take. And so I came out in like, I want to say July-ish of 2017, and then I started hormones in November of that.
Oh, Aaron, you're muted.
Yeah. I think this is the first time I've ever heard of someone actually being admitted to hospital for gender dysphoria. What was that experience like, and how did they approach that in the hospital setting?
It was, well, I can tell you back then. So this was this was obviously like 2000-ish. It was like 1999, 2000. So it was not, when I went in, they misdiagnosed me. They diagnosed me with bipolar disorder. So I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and medicated for that. And I actually lived a good 15 years of my life thinking I had that. Going years unmedicated and medicated, because I have obviously, like, when I'll go back a little bit, when everything happened with my family and like they disowned me after I went to go live with my biological mom, and then I left to go live with my girlfriend. After my girlfriend and I broke up, which was only like a year after she went away to school, I really lost track of my life. So I fell into drugs and alcohol and stuff for about 4 or 5 years. So I think that was partly to do with the fact of the hospital misgendering me not understanding that I was bipolar, because I didn't have the signs of that. Like, yes, I was depressed, but I was not manic by any means. There were certain things that just didn't make sense to me. But of course, I'm having a medical professional tell me I have this disorder. So I'm just thinking, okay, So I took the medication for a few years, and then obviously I turned to self medication through drugs and alcohol for many years. And so when I finally decided to go back to therapy when I was around like in my late 20s, I finally got out of drugs and alcohol, and I said I really need to work on some past trauma and issues that came up in my life. When I decided to do that, and I went to see my therapist, after I don't know how many, visits, she was just like, you don't have bipolar disorder. Like, you don't have that. You definitely have depression and anxiety and social anxiety and PTSD, but you don't have that. You were misdiagnosed, and honestly, that was pretty crazy to find out like in my late 20s, to like live like almost half of my life thinking I had a disorder that I didn't have. So that really kind of turned me off. I mean, I still continue to go to therapy, but it really turned me off to like pharmaceutical use of, like for depression and anxiety. So even when I was going to therapy for a while. I first tried like herbs and stuff. I was like, I don't want to be on any meds. Like, let's try herbs and like certain, supplements and stuff. And obviously, I did try that stuff and it didn't work. And I did have to go on medication at a point for my depression and my anxiety. But yeah, I just feel like that to me, like that, it was very traumatizing to me to be put in the
Mhm.
hospital for that because I don't think that that was something that was needed for me. And, it was to the point where, like I said, I was in there for almost 2 months and, my parents would come, like we would have like weekly family therapy sessions. And so they would come, and there were a few times they brought my pastor, and he was literally like preaching to me, like, like basically trying to preach the gay away. And so honestly, it was a very traumatic experience for me. And so, in many respects, I kind of understand why I went down that route of drugs and alcohol to like cope with, all of that stuff because to me, I didn't understand it. I didn't get it. I was like, this doesn't make sense. I understand you can say I have this diagnosis, but it just didn't make sense to me. So later in my life to find out that I didn't have it, and then, to be diagnosed with depression, anxiety, and a couple other things, I was like, okay, this all makes sense. And then finally, when I got that diagnosis of gender dysphoria when I was, like 34, I was like, wow, like this all makes sense. Like even related to depression, anxiety. Obviously my PTSD is a separate thing that happened that's due to that. But I also have OCD too, and I was like that kind of. I was like, wow, I feel like a lot of that was kind of like wrapped up into gender dysphoria, and honestly, in some ways, wishing maybe I would have known that sooner. Not that I could have transitioned sooner, but just the knowing. Because like really, when I found that out and had that diagnosis, it really validated me as a person. Just to be like, wow, this really is a thing, and like here's something tangible for me to hold on to and say, this makes sense. Like finally, there's something that makes sense to me.
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting how people react to getting that
Explained a lot for you.
diagnosis. Yeah, because some people they find it's like, okay, finally I have an answer to why I feel this way, and other people are really resistant to the concept of gender dysphoria being a diagnosis. And there's a real
Yeah,
push, especially in recent years, right, to just do away with that diagnosis or framing the diagnosis as um, that's just the distress as a result of um, other people's reactions to us and not wanting to pathologize being trans. But for you, it sounds like it's like that was a helpful to get that diagnosis as an explanation for what you were experiencing.
yes, absolutely. Like to me, it was a very validating experience for me. And like I said, about 6 months after I was got that diagnosis, I decided to start hormones and I started testosterone, and things started looking up for me. I mean, of course, there were rough patches throughout, my transition so far. There always have been, but I think that's life. I mean, it's not just transition, but once I had top surgery, which was in the end of 2019, that's when I really like felt true inner peace is what I call it. Like really everything for me just kind of was like, just like calm and peaceful inside. And for me, that was truly like a very healing moment for me after that happened because I was really able to just like feel comfortable in my body and feel comfortable as myself. So
So what was the timeline of your transition? So you received the diagnosis, and then how long? Well, I guess first of all, how long had you been seeing that clinician before you got the diagnosis? And then how long did it take from getting the diagnosis to starting the medical pathway?
yeah, sure. So my first therapist, like I said, I saw him for about 6 years, and then when we really got down to like the nitty gritty of the possibility of me being trans and all of that, and it's not that she never denied it, but she also never diagnosed it. That wasn't her field, because she was just a therapist. So she was like, I have somebody that you can go see, this gender therapist, and so I saw her. I was affirmed by the third meeting with her, saying you have gender dysphoria. And then I would say 6 months after that was
Okay.
when I started hormones. And back then in 2017, when I started hormones, that required a doctor. Oh, well, I think it was more so my insurance company that required all of this, but I had to get a letter from my therapist, stating that I had gender dysphoria and why I needed to go on hormones. I obviously signed an informed consent form. informed consent therapy for that as well with my doctor. And then my doctor didn't like. It's not like I went to my doctor right away and he gave me the testosterone like the first time. That's not what happened. I went to my first appointment. We talked about it. He basically gave me all the info. He said, "Go think about this." And we set up our next meeting. We'll talk about it next time. So I did. I went home, talked about it with my wife. He gave me the informed consent sheet to read. He's like, "You don't have to sign it. Come back if you have any questions." Blah blah blah. My wife and I like literally sat down at the table, read through the entire because back then it was a 5-page document, the 5-page document, and went through each of the things and these are the side effects, these are the possible things, these are the permanent things that will happen, blah blah blah. And so we sat down together and I was like, this is still something I want to do. I understand the risks of all of this, so when I went back to see him, I said, okay, I think I definitely want to go down this path. And he said, all right, I need you to get a letter from your therapist. My doctor also required that. So he said, I need you to get a letter from your therapist for me to, prescribe this and give it to you. So I did. So I think it was probably from that appointment, maybe 2 or 3 weeks, I want to say I got the letter. And then I went back and then I started hormones. After that, he first ran like blood work and a blood panel and all that to make sure I was healthy enough and, everything was good to start hormones. And then I started the hormones then. And then actually a really funny story, the first 6 months of my being on hormones, I was trained improperly on how to do the shot. And they trained me in office. But in order to draw the testosterone, because I do IM injections, they trained me to do it to like the wrong milliliter, like line. And so I was doing a tenth of what I was supposed to be taking for the first 6 months, which honestly I'm kind of grateful for, to be honest, because I feel like at first I was really mad. I feel like we were always like early transition. We really want things to happen fast, and you're motivated, and so I was like really pissed off when I first found out about it. But in the end, like looking back, I'm kind of happy because I know quite a few people who have kind of like their doctors more so did like a wean process of weaning you on, where it was like a low dose. Mine was not like that. Mine was like straight up like, we're going to start you at 0.5 milligrams. And then what I think, because I went to 2 different offices, I see a different doctor now, but I started at a clinic first. And what I thought was funny was because I had to start going every 3 months, right? They would check my blood panels every 3 months to see how everything was going. And like, obviously my testosterone wasn't like going anywhere because I was taking a tenth of what I was supposed to be taking. And my estrogen wasn't going down. It was still in the female range. All this stuff. I was having all these issues for the first 6 months. And it really pissed me off that honestly the doctors couldn't figure it out, because I was the one that called them finally and said, look, because I watched some YouTube videos and stuff of people like drawing. And I was like, I think they taught me wrong. And I was like, I didn't want to correct it myself, right? So I called the doctor and said, look, I just want to come in real quick and can you guys just show me and make sure I'm doing this right? And when I went in, I actually saw the doctor that time, and he was like, yeah, the nurse trained you wrong. And they actually asked me, they were like, who is the nurse? We need to make sure we're retraining these people to do that. But the doctor that I saw there ended up opening his own practice. And so that's the doctor that I see now, just at a different office. But he's actually really well known in Michigan. His name is Dr. Powers. You guys may have heard of him, but he's actually really well known throughout the transgender community, especially with male to female transitioners. There's a Powers method out there. It's all based off what he does, a method that he created. So, but yeah, and then so I was gonna say I took hormones again from the end of 2017 till I got top surgery 2 years later, or like almost 2 years later to the date. And that was in November of 2019, and that required 2 letters actually. I required 2 letters, of one from a PhD, psychiatrist, and one from my therapist. So I had to get 2 letters for that. And then I've not had bottom surgery. I have no plans to have bottom surgery at all. That's not something I want, just due to the risks and the complications of all of that. And I do plan to have a hysterectomy at some point, obviously, but whenever that happens.
And have you been having any problems or complications?
Yeah, that's one thing I'm torn about.
Well, I mean, I do. I mean, I have, and I like being honest about that. So, sure. So basically, I didn't really have too much in the beginning. Really, anything going on. Like I said, besides like that, I was taking less than I was supposed to, which honestly probably helped better. Um, but about well, I can say one benefit about 2 years in, I was able to go off my antidepressants. So I no longer take those and haven't taken those since. I am still on an anxiety medication, but that's it. So that's the only medication I take, like based for any of my other disorders that I have, and that works good. So that's nice. But about, I want to say 2.5 years, about the 2.5 year mark, I had a huge blood pressure spike. Like
Mm.
my blood pressure was in check the whole time. I had no problems, and then my blood pressure just started to go through the roof. So like currently, I'm on three blood pressure medications. It is regulated, but I do have to take three blood pressure medications. Um, and then I want to say year that was about year three, and then 3.5. He put me on an estrogen blocker because my estrogen would slowly come down, but it never went into male range. It was still pretty high. So he eventually put me on an estrogen blocker, which helped with that. So now I'm now on that. And then obviously I've dealt with atrophy. That's something I started dealing with probably within 2 years. Very sporadic within the first 2 years. But it's gotten worse as the years go by. It's still not as frequent. It's not, horribly damaging to my life right now, which is why I haven't gotten a hysterectomy or anything like that. But there is like a topical cream you can use, which is what I use. And then,
Does that cause you
yeah, just
pain?
kind
The
of,
atrophy? Yeah.
yes, it does. Now, like I said, it's not like a constant thing. For me personally, it is orgasm based. So it's for me, it's following an orgasm. It's like, however, it does happen, and I have noticed like now I'm almost 6 years into my transition now. So it does come on like randomly sometimes, and to me, the best way I always describe it is like the way cramps used to feel, but worse. Like as a female who had a period, it just yeah, it's very hard. But for me, it happens pretty frequently. If I have an orgasm, it could last anywhere from like 30 seconds to 5 minutes, and then be kind of sore the rest of the night. And I don't even have like penetrative. Like I personally don't get penetrated during sex, so that's not even part of the issue. So yeah, I
I
mean
have the
that is
exact
some.
same experience.
Do you?
Yeah, yeah, and it feels yeah exactly, but it's not worse because I used to have incredibly painful periods. So I was very glad when those stopped. But yeah, that few years into transition, I started getting randomly that same kind of pain, not knowing what it was, assuming it had something to do with testosterone's impact on my, uh, you know. Uh, gynecological functioning. But yeah, then for a while it was pretty consistent. Yeah, like post orgasm, it's just like immediately set in, and then yeah, then go away. It's I haven't had it in quite a while, and I'm really grateful for that. But a few years ago, it seemed to be like pretty consistent, which yeah sucks. But I've never heard
Do
anyone
you?
else describe exactly that experience. So
And do you use the creamer or anything for it, or do you not
no,
use
I
anything?
I don't. No, 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 no.
No.
Just
Well,
because it's like I'm wondering what kind of, because when I've heard people talk about atrophy, they're talking about like shrinking of the vaginal canal or something, and that's not something I've ever been. It's probably happening. I'm not aware of it, but it's not an area that. Um, anyway, so the topical never seemed like it would be useful in any way because it's so very much internal. Um, so, like, what do you mean by topical? How does that work?
well, I mean, honestly, I was gonna say it's like one of the most dysphoric things to have to do. Like, it's not a fun thing to do, but it's basically like a tampon. I mean, you actually have to insert it and inject it.
Okay.
So yeah, and so it's like a cream. So I mean, it's a dysphoric thing to do, but it does actually help. It does help me personally if I use it,
Okay.
like So
That's good
uh,
to know.
like
Okay.
I said, I can't. I can't explain the mechanics of why it does, but it's something I talked to my doctor about, and he said, this is something we can do, and this has worked for a lot of people, so I definitely was willing to try it, and it does work. And like I said, it's not to the point now, almost 6 years in, it's not happening every time. Now it has actually. There was like I said, kind of like a really like a max peak of it about 3.5 years for me, where it was literally happening every single time, and it was but it has slowly, and I don't know if that's because of the use of the cream. It's not, because when I first got prescribed it, I had to use it like every day for the first week, and then I think weekly for a month, and then you use it as needed after that. So I try to use it. I want to say every 3 months, even if it's not as needed. And to me, it seems to really help. So
Right.
I do still experience it occasionally from time to time, but it is better. Because my worry was that I would just end up going to get a hysterectomy and getting it taken care of, so I wouldn't have to do that. So almost everybody I've talked to with that, and I don't know if either of you have, but everybody I've talked to who has had a hysterectomy does not deal with that issue anymore. So, I if it ever got to a point of being, a very often constant thing, then I would obviously take care of it in that form and fashion if I felt the need to. But the cream does work for me. Yeah.
Great, great. Yeah, I have not had a hysterectomy, and I'm kind of torn. I always go back and forth on whether or not I should. I know, so many years on testosterone, it's pretty dangerous not to. But then I'm also wondering, civilization collapse. I want to be able to produce my own hormones. So,
No, honestly, I thought the same thing. Like
yeah,
I go through the same thing of like, should I not? If I do, should I keep part of it so I still can produce estrogen in
right,
the event that, like you said, in this cataclysmic event that
right.
I can't get testosterone anymore, and I want to be able to at least produce some hormone in my body. So yeah,
Yeah,
I battle with that as well. So I
yeah, relatable.
don't.
I had my hysterectomy almost right away. That was one of the first things I did. So I haven't had the experience of atrophy, but it can be very dangerous. I mean, Buck Angel has
Yeah,
described his experience of almost dying from it because he
yeah.
developed atrophy. He wasn't really aware of it. He developed an infection and then sepsis, and I think he said he was in Mexico when he had to be rushed to hospital for the infection.
Yeah, that is what happened. And like his whole story is weird because some of his organs fused together, and it was crazy. And honestly, like reading up about it and stuff like that, I could see how over that amount of time. I mean, because Buck Angel's been almost for 30+ years. I can get why it might have happened over that amount of time. So that is always something like it's always like a not necessarily a fear, but kind of always like this thing in my back. I'm like, I'm going to have to do that at some point. I feel like I will have to do that at some point because of the long term effects of testosterone on those organs. But um, can I ask you why you had it so soon? Like, were you I know, like, did you have extreme bottom dysphoria? Like, is that why, like, to the organs, or was that just
No,
something you wanted? You knew you wanted right out the gate.
I knew I wanted it right off the gate. I mean, I had a very complicated relationship with those organs just because I had so many gynecological problems and an extreme amount of pain. And when I started testosterone, um, that a lot of that did resolve because it stopped my menstrual cycle, and so I wasn't having associated pain anymore. But I was just after so many years of being rushed to hospitals because of gynecological problems, I was ready. It's like, no, I want to just get rid of those organs. I want to be done with the pain. And because it got to a point where
No, I
the
get that.
pain was so consistent that it was, there were, I would sort of track, and it wasn't even necessarily always in relation to having periods. So it was really unpredictable when I would get an attack of this pain, and I could be out somewhere like at a mall or on vacation or something, and I'd get an attack of pain and I'd be doubled over. And so I was just ready to never have to deal with that again.
I understand that. That makes total sense. Yeah.
Cool. So, yeah, it's been great to hear your transition story. But so when did you decide, like, what were you concerned about in terms of just the public conversation that inspired you to step forward and speak publicly as you have been?
Oh, sure. So that, I mean, that kind of turns back to a political awakening. I'm a longstanding Democrat. I voted Democrat in every election since I was able to. Um, and it wasn't until like 2020 when like COVID happened and stuff like that. And even when COVID first happened, I was very much like, got to clean everything, masks, everything. I was still like heavy CNN watcher. Like I always admitted that. Like I was big into the news, watched CNN all the time. And so, what really started happening for me in 2020 was I just started to see, obviously, this huge divide in the country of the splitting with the election and everything, and then I started to see huge discrepancies in the news. So whether I was CNN or I'm watching Fox or I'm watching whoever, it's like everybody was covering a story differently. Some were leaving stuff out, some weren't even covering it, some were throwing a whole different spin on it. And I was like, I basically just internally started to go, why is why is this one saying this and why is this one saying that and why are these numbers this and these numbers that, and I really just was like, what's going on here? So I started to really like dive deep and do my own research on like news articles and stuff, and I would read like 20 or 30 articles and just like find them from different news sources and read them all. And I started to see that there was a way each certain media companies were doing stuff where they were spinning stories to fit like their narrative and what they were looking for. And uh, I just got to this point where, like I said, I consistently started to see it with multiple things in the media. It wasn't just trans issues. It wasn't, it was COVID. It was a bunch of different things. And so when it got to the point where I was like, wow, I have to case through 20 or 30 articles to really know the truth. And I'm still like basically coming up with my own truth of what I figured out from those 30 or 40 articles, um, was really like my slow awakening. Like I wasn't fully out of unwoke yet. That didn't happen, but it did really kind of start to open my eyes. And I was like I'm not really sure if I'm starting to believe the media now, and what's really going on with all of this. And it wasn't until I'd say probably like 2021, probably like mid 2021 was when I really started to see the LGBTQ stuff ramp up, right? So they started talking a ton about trans rights and all this stuff, and that's when the medically transitioning of children came in, and like really started coming into the surface of being talked about a lot. And when that first came out, I I had like a really quick aversion to it because I was like, I already know how many problems I have. Like, I remember reading the informed consent paper, and I was like, I don't see how children, like, technically, to me, at least in my personal opinion, medical transition is still pretty experimental. It's like I'm not saying that we don't have research on like the studies of testosterone and what it does to the body. We do, but they didn't do enough research of like people after transition and how things went and like extended research. And so I just felt like there were just so many things that were really just like confusing me with the whole thing. And like I said, is immediately when kids brought up, I really just was like, I gotta look into this more. I gotta understand why we even are talking about this. Because if it were to be happening, like I said, it should be happening in these very rare instances because people with gender dysphoria are very rare. Like this is not a common occurrence. And then I actually had an instance in my family, like within my family, where my niece went through something, with the gender identity stuff, and she was talking to my sisters about all that stuff, and she was talking to me about that stuff, and basically she was going through like the whole like I think I'm non-binary, I think I'm trans, and I started to see that evolution of that happening in high school because she was in high school at the time, and then I was really like something's up. And so as I've been doing my research that whole time, I'm still trying to gather everything on like puberty blockers and everything going on, and like what is the correct course of action, like what do I think is right, in this situation. And eventually, like through all the research and everything I compiled, I was like, oh, I just feel I need to speak out about this because, like, as a person who's transitioned and who has had medical side effects from that, even doing it as a fully consenting adult and knowing that those were the risks, I'm like, children can't, to me, a child can't sit there and say, I can know that I can consent to these risks happening in my life later in my life, or things that can happen. I know, like I've always said before, like I made some of the worst decisions of my life from like 16 to 26. So like
I
I
think we all do.
yes, so it's like you're very impulsive, you're very, you want what you want when you want it. We were all like that. And I feel like in a society, like a lot of people have forgotten to like go back and remember what you felt like at that time. I feel like it's very simple if you just go back and try to think about what you felt like as a teenager, as a child, because like puberty is horrible for almost everybody going through it. It's not like it's just it's horrible for trans people. Like, yes, it might be worse for trans people, but it's like everybody's having a very uncomfortable time, and especially women. Like, girls are having a hard time with puberty. It's not. I've talked to many women who are just like, yes, like that's not a fun time for me. Why would I ever think that? So, um, I feel like when it really started to turn with like pushing, I felt like they were really pushing medical transition on children. I was like, yeah, this is something I don't think is smart, and I don't think we should be doing, because in my research, I also read all the research from other countries, who have been doing this before us, a long time before us, and had started to really pull back on that. And, whether they're putting it in research settings, experimental settings, stuff like that. And I was like, well, if all these countries have all this long-term research about this, then why aren't we paying attention to what they're doing? And, they basically have done the research for us. And I just feel like we're putting kids in a very vulnerable place right now. And we're not, like, as a society in general, like there's been a desensitization, then I can't say that word, desensitization of society, with a lot of things going on. And I feel like I hate the fact that like trans is such a political issue right now, because it's like I don't want my identity to like constantly be this political football all the time. Like I wanted to just transition and just like go on and live my life. I'm sure you guys probably wanted to do the same, you know. And it's like I felt really caught in the crosshairs of that, because I'm still like, generally very early in my transition, and in a way sometimes I'm like, it sucks, to like be like, hey, I have to talk about biology on a daily basis now. I mean, it doesn't bother me, but it's just like, I transition to not have to do that, but it's an unfortunate consequence that comes with fighting for children and for their innocence. And I feel like that's what I'm doing, I feel like I said, children can't consent to these things. Their brains are not fully capable of making decisions like that. Anybody who's around kids, they can change what they like or want, within the drop of a hat. So it's like today, earlier this morning, I want to be a dragon. And later I'm like, oh, I want to be a princess. So it's like, yeah, I just feel like you can't go based off what they're saying. And when I noticed that the whole affirmation, like, uh, constantly affirming right away and not pushing back, like that really bothered me. Because even in my own therapy, my experience with therapy with my first therapist, even when I brought it up, we talked about it. It was never like she just took that in and was like, yeah, you're trans. That makes sense. She was like, let's talk about that. Why do you feel that way? We talked a lot about my religious past and why I thought that affected that. Could that have affected why I feel this way? And I spent a lot of time talking about that. And so I just know that, well, I know personally that I think you need to be an adult in order to make that decision, because there's just too many risks, like physical risks, obviously permanent changes that happen to your body. And I feel like a child cannot consent to that. If a child can't get a tattoo, child can't serve our country, can't serve in the military, then I don't think we should have them making these decisions. And like, just let kids be kids. Like I've always said, I'm okay with like you allowing your child, like we should be celebrating gender nonconformity in general. Like you can allow your child to dress differently if that's what they feel is comfortable for them, or play with different toys and stuff like that. But we don't need to sit here and say just because you do those things and it means you're trans. And I know like some people will listen to this story and even my story today and say, oh well, I had those same experiences as a child where I liked male things, and I always did the male avatar. Those are a lot of general things many trans people say. And it's like that doesn't mean, but there's also a lot of gay women I know who have those exact same stories. And so I can't sit here and say like I wish people would stop looking at us and looking at certain people and just saying like, oh, your story resonated with me, so I'm trans. It's possible you are, but you really need to like fully be able to grasp that situation. And I don't even think like even as an 18, personally at least, even at 18, I could have made that decision. Like I said, I I had no idea like who I really wanted to be and who I wanted to be probably into my, like 31, 32. That's really when that all started to change for me. So I mean, it's so hard for me to sit here and say like a 9-year-old knows exactly who they are. It's just hard. And like I said, I know all the risks and benefits that come with an actual medical transition of
Mhm.
hormones and puberty blockers and all.
Especially as you say, I mean, yes, there are risks. It's not a medically neutral decision when you decide to medicalize. But as you also said, the messaging is quite skewed right now, where young people and their families who are experiencing some degree of cross-sex identification aren't being told that that's a very common experience amongst gay and lesbian people. So if the only message that people are getting is that experience automatically means you're trans, then it kind of makes sense for the average person to say, well, then I guess transition is my solution, right? But they're not getting a complete message, and so it's not really. I've been saying this over and over again. It's not really true informed consent if we're only being given partial information.
No, I absolutely agree with that. And like that's that's one thing that's like I love sharing my story, but at the same time, there's certain aspects, and of course I share them here today because I think it's important. But there's certain aspects I don't always like to share because it's like I don't want to be that person that like they're looking at to go. Because I did that early in my. I mean, I know I was an adult, but I looked to other trans people to kind of see like, oh, is their experience the same? How could that have lined up with how I felt or something, and and whatever. So it's not like that's not a common experience that you're going to look to other people to kind of see like, oh, but like you said, it's a very common experience for gay and lesbian people. And so to sit here and say that that is just a trans thing and that's something that they're going to do, I feel like that's something too that really brought me to the surface of speaking up too, because I feel like through all of this we're like it's like the erasure of gays and lesbians, and it's like we're jumping straight to like trans, and it's like no, allow your child to work through that. And I also think like all the gender ideology and the like 112 genders we have now or whatever is just way too confusing to like put on a child. It's confusing to me. I don't understand it all. I don't even believe in any of it, but the point is to try to sit down and understand it all. It to me like all the genders and gender ideology in general is just like a ways to express yourself. It's either a way you'd like to express yourself socially out in the world. And I don't understand why we have to have all these terms and labels for that. Like people should just be able to be who they are, like, and just be how they want to be. We shouldn't have to have 112 ways because as much as they think they're being inclusive by having these many genders, it actually forces people to put themselves into a box. Like you're reading all of these going, which one am I in? And you're like actually reinforcing them back into these like forced stereotypes and stuff. And like I said, I just wish none of this would have ever came up with this gender ideology because to me it's just like it's just gone too far. And now that it's in front of children, I mean, no, I understand why the society is where it's at today because of it, but it's just like they need to hear all sides of the story, whether, like you said, like if that's from trans people and also hearing other gay and lesbian people say, or gay, lesbian, whatever, say, I had the exact same experience as a trans person, but I, it wasn't gender dysphoria. Like just because I enjoyed as a girl playing with men's, you know, toys does not mean that you're trans. It could just mean that you enjoy masculine things more, and that's okay, you know. And I feel like we've gotten to this point in society where it's just like immediately it's like, you know, a boy plays with a Barbie and they're like, you're trans. And I'm like, no, maybe he just likes Barbies for literally this 5 minutes, and he could literally in 2 seconds pop that Barbie's head off with something I did as a child. Pop that Barbie's head off and, like, you know, throw it on the ground. It's like you don't know that, you know.
Yeah.
And I feel like you know, parents are getting, obviously, I feel like there are some parents that are a little too, you know, like too ready to be like, yeah, that's what's going on. But I also feel like they're being misguided. Parents are being misguided because they're only hearing, certain ones are only hearing one side of the story. They're also being basically manipulated by some doctors and therapists to say that, oh, your child might, you know, hurt themselves, or your child might end up in prostitution or a line of work that you don't like if you don't allow them to do this. And, you know, to me, that's just like, it, you know, you're blackmailing parents at this point. And what parent is going to want to do what they think is best for their child, you know? And I feel like I feel bad for a lot of the parents. I talked to a lot of parents, and that's one of the things that really hurts me the most through all of this, because whether they've lost children because those children have gone to haven states, you know, like California, or you know, they're dealing with this within their home and they don't know how to. And those stories are just really sad because the parents really just want to do what's best for the child, and they just feel like, you know, they're in a state of not being able to push back, because if they do, you know, they're like, could my child get taken away from me? We have seen that in a few cases. And, you know, it's scary to, it's just scary at the times that we're in, especially, you know, I feel like parents, and I want to be like, I'm not a parent myself, but parents should have right, you know, parents raise their children. There's a reason for that, you know. And I get that, like, they, you know, a lot of people blame parents and say, well, okay, even if that you made the decision for them, though, like, you weren't fully informed. But like at the same time, like, back to what you said, they're only getting one side of the story, and if you're only seeing that, of course you're going to be like, oh well, yeah, that's the right way, to go.
Yeah, I feel for the parents.
Yeah, it's really, really, really scary.
It is. We hear from parents quite a bit, you know, saying things like, you know, they've got a young child who's gender nonconforming, and the school and the physician, for example, or a counselor are all telling them, well, you have to socially transition your kid, or else you're a bigot and you're an abusive parent. And the parents, you know, are reasonable and caring and love their kids, and they're like, but maybe this is just gender nonconformity, or maybe it's just going to be a gay boy, and so, but they feel all this pressure and being told that they're an awful bigoted parent unless they're going to affirm and start transitioning their kid, and they're so desperate and they don't know where to turn. And so we ended up hearing from a lot of those parents, not that we can really do much for them other than just sympathize with how difficult that is for them.
Yeah,
but it seems like this,
and that's the same too.
It seems like this messaging has come out of nowhere. Like it was quite sudden, and it's been packaged in a way, and I don't even know exactly who's responsible for that. It seems like a very top-down thing. It's not like we all, as trans people, all met one day and voted on this and came up with this messaging. Like, it's being handed to us just as much as it's being handed to the general population. And I don't know who drafted this, who came up with this plan, but it seems like it was just designed, crafted, and then rolled out to society.
Yeah, no, I agree.
I think a lot of it, yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that so many of the people who got, I mean, the trans trend kind of kicked off hardcore in around 2015. And I think a lot, and those people who were in their like late teens, early 20s around that point and got swept up in the culture that is like the kind of the Tumblr culture, I think has a lot more impact than I think those us older people realized. And I saw a lot of this around, because I'm living in a university city, and a lot of those, so even in 2017 they were just super gung-ho about all things trans, and a lot of them were transitioning to indicate that they are part of that subculture that is trans, right? And and those people are now, they've gotten PhDs and they're in positions of influence in these organizations. And we heard that, Aaron, like with the people who are crafting the APA's guidelines on treating children with gender dysphoria, they are all trans or non-binary themselves. And that's what qualifies them, according to the APA, to write these guidelines. And I think they're writing their own validation into these, it's like it's gotten to the point where the young people swept up in it, rather than addressing that, they're just validating how right it was, how they made the right decision, how this is good, it was the only course they could have taken. And I think they're unloading a lot. I mean, this is one facet. I think there's a lot of socio-political reasons why we are here, but I think one facet that's kind of not, it's kind of overlooked, is just how many of the people who were already harmed by the gender movement are now writing the gender movement. Is kind of what I see happening as part of it.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. Actually, I think that, like you said, I don't know the exact timeline of when it happened, but it obviously, like you said, there were many people who were in their teens and 20s and who were graduating at a time when that really happened. And I do know quite a bit about it, about certain pushes in the school districts in public schools about teaching this stuff, and that's been going on for some time. So I mean, most of the research that I've done shows back about where you're looking about 10 to 15 years back is where this real surge came from. And then, like you said, any children behind that are getting fully indoctrinated with this now at this point. So, like you said, all the people who were teens, 20s have now graduated, got a PhDs, and are now writing all this material and teaching all this material to these young minds. And as we all know, what's the quickest way to get to any group or any group in society? You want to get to the children first. So I mean, you start teaching this movement in school, and then you're bringing up a group of activists, and that's what we're seeing happening. We're seeing this like large group of activism coming below this. Now, I personally believe that there's many components to a lot of this, but I believe that there's a socialist movement under all of this as well. But that's just my personal opinion. But I feel like that there's just a lot of things, behind all of this, and I wish we knew exactly where it was coming from, because I feel like that's one of the hardest things. It's like it's constantly finger pointing. It's like, it's coming from the far left. It's coming from this. Maybe it's the right who's just messing with the left, and it's just so many things. And it's like, I'm not even sure that. I think to me, that's all a distraction. The finger pointing of who is just distracting us from who it's really coming from and what the actual agenda behind all of it is. But to me, in the layers behind all of the gender ideology and the equity and all of that, to me is just a lot of has a lot of tides in socialism and pushing a socialist agenda. So.
Mm-hmm. I have the same opinion you do, and I mean, going back to your comment about how the media is involved in that, and how the media isn't. I feel manipulated. I think the media is manipulating our society and is causing a lot of that polarization. Because you're absolutely right that it's so strange how two neighbors who might have different media sources, right? One might be watching Fox News and the other might be watching, I don't know what, something on the left, and they come up with completely different interpretations of world events, so completely divorced from one another, right? And then hate each other because you think, well, you're stupid, or you're a bigot, or you're whatever because you think this way. But so I'm of the habit, like you are, where I try to look at multiple different media sources for information, because you start to get a more complete picture of what might actually be happening in the world.
Right.
Because the media is so biased.
I think too, we all grew up in a time where, earlier when we were growing up, like the media, to me at least, seemed very honest. We didn't have these issues. Like no matter what channel you watched, you were getting the same news, the same,
relatively, yeah.
Relatively, it was the same. There might have been a slight twist in something, but relatively, we were getting the same news, the same media. It didn't really matter, who it was coming from. I do think that the media has always had an agenda. I mean, no matter what. I mean, it's media, it's entertainment. It makes sense, but in general, we had no problem, like, at least knowing. But like you said, I grew up in a time where it was very easy. Like, even in my household, even though I grew up in a Christian conservative household, my dad was like more liberal. So like we would actually have like debates in the house, and like it was normal to just like talk about political things and talk about things that were different and that we had different opinions on. And one of my friends in my late 20s was like an older lady who was like very Christian conservative and didn't agree. This was when I was still living as a lesbian, and like didn't agree with my lifestyle, but we were like great friends. It was just something we didn't talk about, but she respected me and we respected each other because it was about respect. It wasn't about like this one issue will divide us. And we got to this point in society, like you said, where it was just like now we can't talk about anything. Like it's literally like if you don't like this one thing, like I hate you, and I'm just like this isn't this isn't how society, like a fully functioning society, works. You have to all be able to come to the table and talk about your opinions openly. It's okay to have disagreements. No, not everybody should agree, but we should be able to openly come to the table and talk about those, and not have people constantly attacking us for our views or opinions. And that's become one of the problems too, is like our voices are getting shrouded in all of this by like the activists and by the actual TRAs and the radical activists out there. And like I back to the parents, like I've had so many parents reach out to me to be like, my version of what I thought a trans person is what I'm seeing on the media and the news. And like they meet me or they talk to me and they're like, holy crap, there's like a normal trans person that's just like wants to live a normal life. And I've had so many parents reach out to me and just be like, thank you so much for like being able to sit down, because like I'm a very open and honest person. Like if you reach out to me, and I don't give a crap what questions you ask me. Like I want people to learn from my experience because I want people to truly understand what gender dysphoria is and what it does and the reasons why it causes us to make a choice to medically transition, and why that's needed. Because as we all know, there's certain people on the right who are pushing to eradicate transgenderism. It's like, come on, dude. Like, and of course, there's always going to be a push pull, right? There's always going to be a far left reaction, a far right reaction. But it's just like people have to understand that we've always been here. We exist. We don't exist in the numbers that we're seeing today. There's obviously something going on. The numbers were relatively small prior to all of this. I think like prior to the uptick of everything happening now, people with gender dysphoria is like 0.05% of the world population. So like to sit here and the fact that like I said, we've become this political football when we are literally like this much of the population is just like it gets frustrating at times. Just gets really frustrating.
And that is the harm. That is the harm to trans people when these kind of, I think, strange ideas get packaged and are sold by our media as this is what it means to be trans. Anyone who disagrees with that just way of thinking and how that's been packaged and taught, and or the age appropriateness of teaching that stuff to children, it's like if they can't separate the ideology from trans people, then they are going to dislike us. They're going to, and that, right, I think is a harm that it's doing to our community, because we don't all think that way. We don't all agree with it. Some of us are just as appalled by some of what the activists are doing as the far right is. But but they're not able. But we know, right? We know that I am separate from that ideology because it hasn't always been taught that way. That's a fairly new manifestation. So we can see the separation, but someone who hasn't met the average trans person and talked to them, they just think that is what it means to be trans. So they're rejecting all of it, including us, the individuals.
Right, exactly. And like we said, that is mostly to do with media and the way media projects us, because like I said, it's constantly like, oh, I didn't know there were like normal trans people out here. Like that's one of the comments I get the most. I'm just like, really? Like and I think that's what, like I said, just what bothers me the most, because it's like, why are we being, picked on as like the small very small minority of the population to be like broadcast across all of this, and it's hurting like the true transgender transsexual people who are like really in this, like, that don't agree with, like, most of the people I talk to, like, obviously I do talk to people on the left, but I've been able to get through to a lot of people, like even people in my own life, and people, like, if I sit down and have a conversation with these people, even if it's on Zoom, or as long as we meet face to face and I can talk to you or talk to you on the phone or whatever, almost every single person who may have come across, like, let's just use child transition, if they're okay with that, they support that, and they support puberty blockers. If they sit down with me for an hour, 2 hours, I've changed their mind. And that's almost everybody I've talked to. It's come down to that, because I can show proof, I can show personal experience, and most of them will come to me and say, "Wow, I didn't even hear any of this because I only watched this news network." And as we also know, like, the algorithms of all of our social medias and Google is also keeping you in your bubble. It's keeping you in what you want. So it's actually something I recommend to people, is to read 20 or 30 articles that are all on the political spectrum, because at least your Google searches won't be inundated. Because I'm sure you guys have gotten
Confuse the algorithm.
Yeah, I'm sure you guys have
advice.
gotten into like Twitter spats with people, or Facebook spats, where you're like trying to fight out an issue, and they're like, "Well, I googled that. The first 20 things that popped up on mine aren't anything having to do with drag shows," and they're like, "Oh, but the second picture on yours happens to be a drag store," and it's like we get into this huge argument about, like, "Oh, well, you must be on the right," and I'm like, "No, I just happened to look up enough articles." I said, "Yeah, those pictures that you're showing me are on my top 20, just not in the same order. I mean, it's proof of the algorithm, and Twitter to me, like, I mean, I'm on Twitter, but that's one I try to stay the most off of, because to me it can just be a cesspool at times. I just feel like there is a lot of good things that happen on Twitter, and I've met some awesome people. I mean, both of you especially I've met on Twitter, and I've met a lot of great people, but a lot of the people on there are just there to fuel the fire, and so I try not to interact with those people. But there are sometimes those late night, I'm just in a mood, and somebody says something, and I'm like, "Ugh."
Yeah. There are a lot of bots on social media too, right? So especially like Twitter with it. It's one of the things that trans activists have done, because a lot of them are very tech savvy. So a lot of people don't realize this, but our government uses AI technology to draw information from social media platforms to gauge public opinion about things, rather than old-fashioned polling. And so if you create a bot that can reproduce your message 100 or 1,000 times, it really skews the data on what public opinion is.
Yes.
And here in Canada, I don't know what it's like down in the States, but here in Canada, all of our major news sources, especially the federal ones, are all government controlled. And there's a lot of publication bans happening in Canada right now, a lot of bills being passed. There's talks about like Fox News, for example, being axed from all of our cable packages, so that Canadians won't be allowed to watch Fox News, and a crackdown on news sources being able to post on things like Facebook and Twitter and all those social media sites. So like Google and Facebook, I think it's called Meta now, is the organization that runs Meta and Instagram. So Google and Meta have both announced that they're axing all Canadian news from their platforms because of bills that Canadians are run. So our government is basically controlling what we're allowed to see and have access to through television, so broadcasting and internet. So even Gender Dysphoria Alliance, where we're concerned, that our government could step in and start censoring our content. So it's absolutely crazy.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same here. It's not that bad yet here, but it's. I feel like we're at a point of where it's getting to that. I mean, cancel culture is at its high, it's at an all-time high right now, and we're, as we have Elon claiming Twitter is a free speech platform, yet tweeting out that certain words aren't going to be allowed on his platform. Like, it's hard here because My wife and I constantly talk about how we're supposedly the land of the free, but there's actually a lot of we actually have a lot of our rights infringed on daily by just social media, government, and certain things. But
Mm-hmm.
they obviously do control. I mean, I haven't heard any talk about stopping any messaging on social media or anything like that, but I do know that they control what we see
Yeah.
through the media and what is shown, because sometimes there will be, I'm sure you guys know too, like let's say local things that happen, or I live in Michigan, and so obviously a lot of crime. I'm not near Detroit, but a lot of crime happens in Detroit. Detroit is also a beautiful town in the downtown area. They've brought it up, but there's a lot of crime in the outskirts of Detroit. And so there's a lot of stuff you never ever hear of because it just happens here all the time. But if you actually get, dive deep into the local news, you'll see stuff like that. And that, like I said, I think that's causing a huge problem is the algorithms of all of the social media, because social media connects us all globally, right? So, you know, whether each government has a hand in that, and we know China's government has a hand in their own the way that they produce their media and don't allow certain content there. We
Mm-hmm.
know Russia does that, other countries do that. So to sit here and say, as much as I'm not positive, like I'd have to do the research to see if the US ever admitted that they control that, you know what I mean? But to sit here and say that that's not happening would just be foolish of me to say, because that's literally happening in most countries. I mean, um, and I think that that's something that I wish, at least here, I know in the States, I wish the government would take a little less control and give the states back a little more control
Mm-hmm.
here, because I mean, that's really what we were founded on. And here we are constantly with the government's taking control, and then the monopoly of the market as well, of all these
Yeah.
tech companies and everything buying out everything. And it's like, that's scary to me, like coming to a place of no paper currency. We're getting very close to that.
Mm-hmm.
Scary, because I'm sure, as you guys know, if we get to a place of no paper currency at all, they can literally freeze any of our bank accounts at any time.
Yeah,
Right?
which they
So
trialed here in Canada already. So when Canadian truckers had the truckers convoy, and the media distorted that whole story right from the beginning. So they made it sound like it was total mayhem in Ottawa, that all these truckers came into the city, and it sounded like it was utter chaos. But I know people in Ottawa who said no, it's been a peaceful protest. The truckers actually had permits to park their trucks downtown. And there were stories of media sort of planting things like I think it was like a swastika flag or something that somebody planted for a photo op to show how all these truckers are all just racists, but it was all media planted, right? To skew the story. And the truckers, so they tracked who some of the truckers were, and they froze their bank accounts. And yet being able to peacefully protest is part of our human rights and freedoms here in Canada. But yeah, the way that our government is stepping on our rights, we don't have freedom of speech like you guys do. So your constitution protects freedom of speech. We don't have that. Our Charter of Rights and Freedoms doesn't cover free speech. It does cover our right to assembly. So we are allowed to protest, assemble, and we have a right to think freely, but we don't have a right to speak freely. So it's a little easier perhaps to censor us.
The news and
yeah,
whatnot.
Yeah.
yeah, definitely.
We could probably talk about this for a long time. We're kind of a few. Oh crap! Sorry. Kind of deep into it. But I do have one more question for you before we let you go, Marc, and that is, can you tell us about Transsexual Unity, that organization you're on the board of? What are you guys up
Yeah.
to?
So, we're a group of people, a group of transsexual people. We do have one biological female. It's part of our group as well. Stephanie, the biological female, she's at Puberty Blocker Suck. She's had life experience taking puberty blockers as a biological woman, in which ways that it has destroyed her life and chemically castrated her, and she is very, very knowledgeable in that field. So we have her on. She's very helpful to help us with talk about the puberty blockers, because she has all the information and the personal experience to speak about as just a biological woman having those issues, let alone what it could do to children. Um, and then the other group, all the rest of us are transsexuals who just came together and, obviously we wanted to speak out against the LGBTQ agenda that's happening, the push for medical transition of children, the LGBTQ agenda in schools. And really our focus is to find middle ground and to reach the people who might not understand us or might want to ask questions. Like we always want to have open discussions. We hold weekly Twitter spaces, and that's something we've been really putting a lot of work into right now because we're really just trying to open discussion. I have noticed that in our recent ones it's been pretty hard, and when we do our spaces, we will post like a thought provoking question, usually to hopefully bring in people from both sides because we want opposition. We want to be able to talk about the issues so we can find solutions. We want to be able to come together, find solutions on these issues, so we can actually like move back to a normal progressive society of being able to talk about these issues. So it's been difficult. In the beginning, we did get like some people that would come in with the opposition, but it's been kind of hard to find opposition lately, which is kind of annoying. So if anybody's watching this, please, and you oppose any of these opinions, please go on and like oppose us because we really want to encourage those debates and not have them end in, like obviously we don't want any hate, we don't want anybody like, bashing each other, we don't allow that, but to have general conversation about why you might think puberty blockers are safe and why we don't think they're safe. And, I think we have to get to this point in society where we can just talk to each other and just be open and normal with each other and get back to a place we were like many years ago that I can remember growing up, where it's okay to have different opinions and it's okay. It doesn't mean that we're not a community. It doesn't mean that, and that's what I feel like has happened. The LGBTQ community is like ripping at the seams and we're infighting our own community. And that's something we should not be doing. Like we should be able to come to the table and say, hey, we have differing opinions and we can come to the table and talk about them. And maybe we'll change each other's minds. Maybe we won't, but that doesn't mean that I hate you or you hate me. It means we could just walk away and still fight for any possible rights that we may need or still have. But I shouldn't have to, I've constantly, I'm sure you guys get this too, but I'm constantly called transphobic and I shouldn't have to like calling a trans person transphobic just like cracks me up in general. Like it's just such an oxymoron. And so it's just like, I'm just, I just really, our whole point is just to get the message across and show people that there are just very normal based transsexual people who had gender dysphoria, transition to better their life. They just want to live and present as the opposite sex and move on with society. That's all we wanted to do. We're not pushing an agenda. We don't want your kids to medically transition. And we want people to listen to people with our experience and understand that like we know we went through it, we've had complications, we've had things happen. We can sit here and say through life experience, I know that's not smart for a child to do. And also have the ability for anybody to come and ask any questions. Like we allow all questions. We don't care. Like we aren't the type of group to like get offended by a question. We just want to be as open as possible because I found personally, and many of the people I work with in my group have found that through that openness is how we really build bridges and create community and unity. And that is really what we're trying to do is build back our community, build back the LGBT community as a community with opposing opinions, because that's fine. It's perfectly fine to do that and still love each other. So that's really the core of it.
Sounds like a good group and a good goal.
Yeah.
Nice.
Well, thanks so much for coming and talking to us. It's been great to meet you. I've interacted with you a bit on Twitter, but it's been great to actually just have a conversation.
Yeah, no, it was awesome. I mean, it was great. And if you guys, I'd come back anytime if you want to.
I was going to say, actually, I don't know how your wife would feel about this, but I'm really fascinated with the fact that you transitioned within a marriage, right? And so if she was willing to talk, that might be a great episode to have, is to tell what that was like from both sides of that, if she's willing, of course. Even if she's not, if you want to just have it come back to tell us exactly just from your perspective. But yeah, I think that would be a really good conversation.
Yeah, no, I'll talk to her. She's actually been asked that many times. We did a podcast a couple of years ago. It's not available anymore, but we actually did do a podcast like with it early in my transition where we did talk about a lot of that stuff. But I think she's getting my wife and I will be starting a podcast coming up soon too in the future where we're going to talk about LGBTQ issues and relationship advice. But I do think that's important, and I'm constantly harping her on it, so I'll be sure to harp her on it again. But either way, if she's not willing, I have a lot. Obviously, we've talked a lot, so I can express a lot of the stuff that she's told me through that as well. But it would be best, obviously, to get her full experience of that. So yeah, I'll definitely talk to her.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks again, Marc.
All right, thanks.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Transparency Podcast. If you enjoy our content, please help out our algorithm by hitting like or subscribe. If you'd like to make a donation, follow the link to our PayPal account. On behalf of the Gender Dysphoria Alliance, thanks for your support.